Good morning. Come on in. Come on in. We're going to get started this morning. I have to tell you that I didn't tell the full truth on the email. Can you turn me up just a little bit? Is that possible? That's perfect. Come on in. We're going to get started. So instead of doing a flyover, which we weren't going to have enough time anyway, I wanted to finish the video on Israel. So my email said we were going to do a flyover, but we're not. So I apologize for not telling the full truth, and yeah, that too. But we're going to watch the rest of this Israel video. I had never seen that before, and that's one of the better summaries of Israel from the right after the World War II. And so we're going to finish that. There's about 25-ish minutes left in that video, and then we'll probably get done a little bit early. And what a great time this has been of studying the book of Revelation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you get a chance to email Pastor Chris, he did 99% of the studying of that and putting that together. And so talented man of understanding Revelation. Welcome also for those that are online. I always forget to do that. But we're going to pray this morning. We're going to get that started. If you want the link to the first part of the to the first part of the Israel video, I can send that out to you. I got that from Bo, our tech director, this last week, and so I can get you that whole YouTube. It's on YouTube, the full hour of it. So anyway, let's pray this morning, and we'll get started. Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for our study of the book of Revelation. It has been an amazing journey since January, and we are thankful for that. We thank you that we've been able to study together. We thank you for the people of Israel now, and we just look forward to seeing the rest of this video on the history of Israel and how that fits into the kind of the narrative of the other part of history, the other part of the world. And so we do pray for Israel, even today as there's unrest there. We pray for peace and just pray that you would guide us today. And thank you for each one who's here. Amen. All right, here we go, the video.
Or the defender in his response, we shall do whatever we can earnestly within the limits of our capacity to help alleviate the problem which this aggression has caused.
In the Arab world, the rise of a non-Arab state in the heart of the Middle East was seen as a tragedy and a challenge. Stormy protests erupted all over the Arab world, in Baghdad, in Aleppo in North Syria, and in Aden. The far-flung Arab world was in ferment. In 3 days, 80 Jews were killed in Aden, and 4 synagogues were burned. In the old communities of Yemen and Iraq, where Jews had lived long before Muslim and Arab history had begun, the rise of a Jewish state was like the sound of a trumpet, calling them to change the direction of their lives and to join in the construction of a new society. Operation Magic Carpet, as it was called, airlifted thousands of Yemenite Jews to Israel, the last of them in September 1950. The biblical prophecy seemed to be fulfilled. The Lord shall set his hand for the second time to recover the remnants of his people, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Until 1950, the attempt to emigrate from Iraq to Israel was a capital offense. Many Jews had been killed there. When the law changed, almost all the Jews applied to leave Iraq, an unfortunate 25,000 elected to remain.
A rescue airlift spans the 600 miles from Baghdad to Tel Aviv to bring to safety 54,000 Jews who face a reported reign of terror in Iraq. Planes running 4 to 6 a day have been getting these refugees out at the rate of 10,000 per month. The rescue must be completed by May 31st, the deadline that Iraq has set for Jewish immigration.
For these Sephardim, their arrival in Israel had profound religious meaning, but there was urgent practical demand caused by what had now become a flood of immigrants. At first, the immigrants were settled in villages evacuated by the Arabs in their flight. They made homes out of ruins. When that space was quickly filled, temporary transit camps had to be thrown together, some from old military bases left by the British. On average, nearly 23,000 newcomers were now arriving every month. Even the paperwork presented an administrative challenge. Tents and huts by the thousands were erected, but at times not fast enough to accommodate the flood of immigrants. By the end of 1949, 100,000 people were living in such transit camps. The Ma'barot were primitive and crowded, flooded by winter rains, exposed to the asperity of the summer heat, and cut off from the main cities and villages. All of Israel's available resources in manpower and material were thrown into the effort to assimilate the new arrivals. The reactions of the new citizens were rewarding. The Ma'bara, or Transition Center, was a unique Israeli experiment designed to encourage immigrants to become independent as soon as they arrived. They were housed in tents or huts, but each family was independent in providing for itself. The government or the Jewish agency provided clinics, dispensaries, schools, unemployment agencies, and the other social services. By the end of 1952, 250,000 new Israelis were living in the Ma'barot. But the system resulted in enforced idleness, not alleviated by improvised schemes. It retarded the integration of the immigrants. The Ma'barot were also uneconomic. They placed a strain on Israel's meager financial means. New and better answers had to be found.
And then, after a couple of years, not too many, we started taking people out of these transit camps and putting them in places where hopefully, we hope that in days, months, and years to come, they'll start to be productive. So all in all, in the whole country, we built about 500 villages for newcomers, and during the years, about 25 new towns.
Another development was the creation of extensive new housing projects next to the Ma'barot. People were thus able to move from the makeshift arrangements of the transit camps into brand new accommodations where they could forge a community. As 1949 began, Every available surface was plastered with election propaganda. In January, the people of Israel went to the polls for the first time to elect a government to replace the one that had brought them from the birth of the state to the end of a victorious war. Ben-Gurion's Mapai party, the group of moderate socialists affiliated with Labour, won 46 of the 120 members of the Knesset. It was by far the biggest party in a fragmented parliament. One of the Knesset's first acts was the election of a president. Inevitably, the choice fell upon Dr. Chaim Weizmann. Although the immigrants would eventually become Israel's main economic resource, for the time being, they were Israel's major economic problem. The number of consumers had grown spectacularly. The number of producers had diminished. By the middle of 1949, Israel's fragile economy was nearing collapse. It was necessary to impose strict austerity on the country. The rations were meager, 1 egg per person per week at first, later 1 per month. There was a tremendous hunger for protein. A vigorous black market sprang to life, and the currency began to lose its value. Smuggled dollars brought a premium rate of exchange. It was not good Zionism, but the dealers prospered. Chickens, dead or alive, became desirable out of all proportion to their appearance. Suddenly it became necessary and possible to assume the appurtenances of the state. It was urgent to have an Israeli postal service, Israeli currency and banks, an Israeli airline, a tourist industry, and all the infrastructure and trappings of a modern state, all with a proud stamp of Israeli ownership and sovereignty. Another proud attribute of statehood was the exchange of ambassadors with other sovereign countries. We were honored by the arrival of plenipotentiaries from the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and other nations. Our first ambassador to the Soviet Union was no less a figure than Golda Meir. Our diplomatic representative in Poland, Yisrael Barzilai, was arriving on the scene of the most appalling suffering the Jews had experienced during the war. When the first British ambassador presented himself to our Knesset speaker in President Weizmann's absence through illness, the victory of Zionism over Ernest Bevin was complete. On March the 24th, I secured the decision of the Security Council by 9-1 in favor of Israel's admission to the United Nations. Even that decision had to be fought through in committee and in the Assembly.
The admission of the applicant, if taken, would be the highest consummation of injustice, and it will draw another nail into the coffin of the United Nations.
Israel is the only one of the 160 members that has had to get up and plead for its membership. Normally, you send a letter and you say you want to be a member. But I had to make speeches for 9 hours and a kind of a cross-examination, like in the police court, about why we presume to think that we can be members. There's been nothing like that in the history of any other people.
We look forward to Israel representing and upholding those traditions of freedom and democratic progress.
In the case of the applicant, such evidence is altogether lacking.
The New Zealand delegation will, of course, vote for the admission of Israel.
After a vote of 37-12 for admission, with 9 nations abstaining, Assembly President Herbert B. Ebat announced,
and I therefore formally declare Israel admitted to membership in the United Nations.
As the other members cheered, delegates of the Arab states who bitterly opposed Israel walked out. These are Lebanon, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq.
Early in 1947, when I was a young, rather obscure and completely anonymous Zionist official, somebody had said to me that 1 year from then, you, Abba Eban, will be leading a Jewish delegation in the Security Council, the highest organ of international security, and pleading successfully for a ceasefire, for an end of the war, and above all for the recognition by the world of Israel as a legitimate sovereign state. Well, I just said that's a crazy fantasy. I shall still always retain the feeling in my hands of the rope with which I put our flag on the mast, knowing that in that very moment when the flag went to the top, the status of the Jewish people in history had irreversibly changed. In America, our most powerful friend, President Truman, was running for re-election. He was not expected to win.
And then it happened. The man from Missouri awoke from a refreshing sleep to learn that he'd been returned to the White House by a mandate of the people.
I felt that we were rather the conscience of the free world. And that's the reason why I so promptly recognized the new state of Israel.
I take the first opportunity coming on these, stepping on the ground of this great capital to express my heartfelt thanks to the President of the United States and to the government of this country for all they've done in making out of Israel a reality.
We took comfort from the militant and efficient way in which American Jewry was organizing itself under the somber but dynamic leadership of Abba Hillel Silver. Our supporters were not afraid to take to the streets or to the largest auditorium.
Salute to Israel, American Zionist leader Dr. Abba Hillel Silver.
And behind that front line are the vast spiritual and physical reserves and resources of world Jewry, which has resolved that it is tired of being stepped upon and will not permit itself to be stepped upon any longer.
I was 33 when I became the leader of our effort in the United Nations and of our embassy in Washington. In September 1950, I presented my credentials to President Truman. Ben-Gurion and Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet wished me to develop a tradition under which an Israeli ambassador would carry weight in America and in the world, and not only in official Washington. One of my early duties as ambassador was to arrange for Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to make his first visit to the United States.
War of independence, fought after 6 millions of our people have been exterminated by the Nazis, proved once again that the cause of justice, faithfully pursued, must triumph in the end.
Next stop for the Israeli premier is New York City. In a parade through its towering canyons, the leader of one of the world's newest republics is hailed by 1 million people.
Visiting the White House, Ben-Gurion presented President Truman with a symbol of the state that he had helped into existence. From September 1950, I was ambassador to the United States as well as to the United Nations. My first aim was to create a legal and political basis for American-Israeli cooperation and alliance. In 1951, Dean Acheson and I negotiated the eligibility of Israel for American aid and signed the first agreements of friendship and commerce.
James G. McDonnell, first U.S. ambassador to Israel, with former Miss America Bess Meyerson at left and Shoshana Damari, Israeli folk singer, campaigned in behalf of Israel's $500 million independence bond issue.
There's a general impression that Israel is busy with only 2 things, politics and austerity. But when you get to Israel, you'll find that not politics or austerity, but production, building, new settlements, a tremendous spirit of achievement and progress dominates the whole country.
The whole of Jewish history is an eternal celebration of resilience. This quality has rarely come to finer expression than in the manner in which Israel now created its own opportunities. We inherited an economy almost exclusively dependent on agriculture. It was imperative to exploit such natural resources as we had and to build an industrial base. We needed manufacturing plants. Above all, we needed irrigation, and so much effort and ingenuity was spent in utilizing our meager supply of water. The pipeline to the Negev caused the desert to bloom. Israel even entered the textile and automobile industries. In December 1949, the United Nations decided, though without much conviction, that it would try to establish an international authority over Jerusalem. Having turned its back on Jerusalem when the city faced famine and destruction in 1948, the United Nations belatedly claimed jurisdiction. The only effect was to bring about a resolute Israeli reaction. Ben-Gurion moved to the Knesset from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, where it took an oath never to leave that city again. The central problem in the relations between Israel and the Arab world has been the persistent attempt of Arab governments to deny our legitimacy as a state. We had nourished the hope that Arab-Jewish coexistence would find its first expression in a settlement with Jordan. There was nothing of the inhuman virulence which marked the attitude of the other Arab nations toward Israel's existence. The embodiment of this hope was, of course, King Abdullah. Abdullah's ambitions had attracted the enmity of his fellow Arabs, especially the Egyptians.
King Abdullah, who was 69, was shot as he was going to pray at a mosque close to that famous shrine, the Mosque of Omar.
In Egypt, the corrupt and profligate government of King Farouk was overthrown by a military coup. A bloodless revolution brought Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser into power. King Farouk sailed to Italy for a few more years of the good life.
It is my earnest conviction that peace can and will be achieved in Palestine at an early date.
All attempts to reach a lasting peace with the Arabs failed. They organized a boycott of Israeli goods and markets and put pressure on their own trading partners to withdraw their recognition of Israel. We had evidence that their military staffs were preparing for the next war. I felt that we must create a bipartisan American-Israeli tradition. I arranged an early meeting between Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet and President Eisenhower in Washington. The change in the leadership of the United States was a watershed for Israel. In May 1952, I spoke at a dinner honoring President Truman. I said, "We do not have orders or decorations. Our material strength is small and greatly strained. We have no tradition of formality or chivalry. One thing, however, is within the power of Israel to confer. It is the gift of immortality. Those whose names are bound up with Israel's history never become forgotten. We are therefore now writing the name of President Truman on the map of our country."
I'm very touched and grateful, and a little bit overwhelmed. They have a village name for me, but when they're talking about a statue, wanting me to join George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Cham Weitzman, I have about come to the conclusion that I'm not ready yet to go into a piece of marble.
For the first 5 years, from 1948 to 1952, nothing had seemed to go wrong. Then there followed 3 nightmare years in which almost nothing seemed to go right. In November 1952, the first president, Chaim Weizmann, died.
Through the town of Rehovot, Israel, came the mourners, Arabs as well as Jews. 250,000 to pass the catafalque on which the body of Chaim Weizmann lay in state.
Without Truman and Weizmann, the scene was unfamiliar. More unexpectedly, Ben-Gurion resigned in 1953. Ben-Gurion was a buoyant, vigorous, pugnacious, defiant man who sent out sparks of energy in all directions. For over 2 decades, he had carried heavy burdens. When Ben-Gurion resigned the premiership, he made it clear that he was leaving office, but he was not leaving power. Nothing in him was exactly what it seemed. Israel would face a different future with new figures in the center of the drama.
The defender in his response.
All right. Well, there we go. It is now 10:50, and so we're done for the semester. But we just encourage you. I want to remind you real quick that the 20th Father's Day that we're having the 10:30 service. If you're going to be going to the 11:15 service, we're moving that to 10:30 for the summer. We have a tent out by the. You can't see it yet. It's an invisible tent. It's not up yet. But we're getting it ready. We have the concrete forms with the eye bolts ready to go. And in the next 2 weeks, on the 16th, in fact, we're going to be putting it up for Father's Day. And the 10:30 service is going to be out there outside. So we're looking forward to that. Thanks again for being part of this class. On behalf of Pastor Chris and myself, it's been a joy and an honor to have that. So if you have any questions, we got a few more minutes. Otherwise, you are dismissed to have some fellowship. There's coffee in the back. I think the coffee stand is open Mike's not in here. I think it's open one more week, and then it goes into construction mode. So it's going to be across the hallway there where the library used to be. So God bless you guys. Thanks again, and goodbye to those that are online. All right, take care.